In the shadowy centuries of the Middle Ages, words were never just words. They could carry weight, wield power, and in many cases, summon flames. A single sentence whispered in the wrong corner of a village, a stray opinion muttered in a crowded marketplace, or even a question posed too boldly in church could mean the difference between life and a slow, agonizing death. The wrong phrase could send you straight to the stake, where your screams would mix with the crackling of firewood and the heavy prayers of those watching you burn. It was not just a time of swords and castles, but a time of silence, suspicion, and the terror of saying the wrong thing. The danger lay in challenging authority, especially religious authority. The Catholic Church during much of the Middle Ages held enormous influence not only over people's spiritual lives, but over politics, education, and law. It was the mouthpiece of God and the final word on truth. To question it was to question divine will itself. Imagine yourself in a small stone chapel, attending Mass with the rest of your village. The priest begins preaching about the Holy Trinity, the virgin birth, or the necessity of indulgences. If you leaned over to your neighbor and asked, "But how do we know this is true?" you might find yourself in serious trouble. Even innocent curiosity could be construed as heresy. Heresy was not just disagreement. It was seen as a disease of the soul, a poison that could spread from one person to another, corrupting the faithful and endangering the eternal fate of a community. Church authorities saw it as their divine mission to root it out. Heretics were often tortured, imprisoned, and publicly executed to serve as a warning to others. Burning at the stake was not just a punishment. It was a purification. Fire was believed to cleanse the soul, to burn away the heresy, and perhaps give the condemned a final chance at redemption. And so, people burned. In the name of faith, they were turned into living torches. You did not even need to declare yourself against the church. Voicing alternative beliefs could be fatal. If you said there was no hell, or that God would never condemn a soul for eternity, or that priests were mere men with no divine power, you risked being labeled a heretic. Say something like, "I think the Bible should be in our own language," and you would be echoing the same words that got scholars like William Tyndale hunted down and killed. The church insisted that Scripture could only be interpreted by the clergy, suggesting otherwise challenged the very foundation of ecclesiastical power. Even scientific ideas were dangerous. Think of a curious soul who gazes at the stars and muses. What if the earth goes around the sun? In today's world, that would earn you a thoughtful discussion. In the Middle Ages, it might earn you a death sentence. Centuries before Galileo, medieval thinkers like Giordano Bruno hinted at cosmological ideas that clashed with religious doctrine, and they paid with their lives. You could not just ask questions about how the world worked, if the answers might contradict Scripture. Magic was another verbal minefield. A harmless joke about casting a spell or calling someone a witch could spiral into deadly consequences. If someone got sick, crops failed, or a storm destroyed part of a village, people looked for someone to blame. It only took one person to say, "I heard her mumbling to herself last night," or he said he spoke to a spirit, and suspicion would bloom like wildfire. Accusations often came from neighbors, family members, or even children. Once suspicion was cast, no defense was strong enough. A whispered spell or chant, even if meant in jest, could become your final words before the executioner came knocking. Politics was no safer. Rulers were considered divinely appointed, their authority sanctioned by heaven. Saying that a king was unjust, or that a noble had stolen land, could be considered treason. Even a murmur that someone else would be a better ruler could seal your fate. Peasants learned to keep their heads down and mouths shut. Even when the tax collectors stripped them bare, or their sons were conscripted to die in foreign wars, rebellion brewed in secret, in coded songs and cryptic tales, because to speak openly was to invite the gallows or worse. Sometimes it was not even about what you believed, but who you were. If you were a foreigner, a Jew, or someone with strange customs, your words were already suspect. Speaking your native tongue in public, praying differently, or sharing ideas that didn't align with Catholic orthodoxy could lead to accusations. The Church's suspicion of outsiders was both religious and cultural. Crusades were not just launched against Muslims in the Holy Land, but also against Christians deemed deviant, such as the Cathars of southern France. They were wiped out not for deeds but for beliefs. Women, too, had to be careful. A woman who spoke too boldly, too often, or too cleverly could be labeled a witch. If you were a healer who used herbs, a midwife with too much knowledge, or simply someone who refused to marry or obey, your words could be twisted into evidence of sorcery. She said the pain would go away, might be taken not as comfort, but as a curse. She speaks to animals could doom you. Women who dared to educate themselves or write about spiritual matters, like Hildegard of Bingen, walked a razor-thin line. One wrong phrase and they could fall from favor to flames. The invention of the printing press in the late Middle Ages brought even more danger, because now your forbidden words could reach many. Once you put ink to parchment, there was no taking it back. The church responded with lists of banned books and hunted those who dared to publish unapproved ideas. Owning a copy of a controversial text, even one page torn from a heretical work, was enough to be condemned. Knowledge was a luxury, but it was also a trap. You had to be clever not just in thinking, but in hiding your thoughts. Yet, despite all this, people did speak. They whispered behind closed doors, passed secret notes, taught their children forbidden stories. In times of plague, famine, and war, faith often faltered and gave way to questions. And the more the authorities tried to silence them, the more determined they became to speak. That is what made it all so volatile. The tension between silence and speech, obedience and truth, flickered everywhere like candlelight in a dark chapel. Sometimes that light caught fire. The Middle Ages were not merely a time of darkness, but of struggle between those who demanded silence and those who needed to speak. The cost of words was high. It could mean exile, torture, or death. But the price of silence was higher still. To say what you really believed was to risk your life, but to stay quiet was to slowly bury your soul. And so you stood in the village square, your heart pounding, watching the flames rise around someone who had dared to say what you had only thought. You clutched your coat tighter, glanced at the faces around you, and bit your tongue. Because you knew, even if no one had heard you yet, that you too had whispered something once, something dangerous. And now, the wind carried smoke and screams, and the bitter reminder that in the Middle Ages, even a single sentence could kill. Thanks for watching, and if this video left you a little shaken, that's because it should. The Middle Ages were not just about knights and castles, but about fear, silence, and the deadly weight of words. Imagine living in a world where even a passing thought or a whispered question could mark you for death. It is chilling to think that the freedom we take for granted today was once a luxury only the bold or the doomed dared to reach for. But history reminds us why our voices matter. Every person burned at the stake for asking questions or challenging power paved the way for a future where truth has a chance to be heard. So if this story made you feel grateful, curious, or even angry, hit like and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done back then? Would you have stayed silent or spoken out? And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from history that still echo today. Because sometimes, the past has more to say than we ever imagined. Stay curious, stay brave, and until next time, keep questioning the world around you.